What if everything you thought you knew about love was actually a dangerous psychological trap? Carl Jung, the legendary Swiss psychiatrist, discovered something disturbing about modern relationships that most people never realize. What we call love is often nothing more than a compulsive cycle that keeps us trapped in patterns of suffering. Through his groundbreaking work with patients, his own tumultuous relationships, and decades of studying the human psyche, Jung uncovered the dark truth about romantic obsession, codependency, and the psychological loops that masquerade as love. This is the story of how Jung's revolutionary insights can free you from the cycles that are destroying your relationships and your life. Era stares at her phone for the 100th time today, waiting for his text. Her heart races every time the screen lights up, then crashes when it's just another notification. She hasn't eaten properly in days, can't focus at work, and has canceled plans with friends all because of him. When people ask if she's happy, she says she's in love. But is this really love, or something far more sinister? Carl Jung would have immediately recognized Sarah's condition. Not as love, but as what he called a psychological loop. A compulsive cycle that hijacks our rational mind and keeps us trapped in patterns of suffering. Jung discovered that what modern society celebrates as passionate love is often nothing more than unresolved psychological wounds playing out through another person. Today, we're going to explore Jung's most disturbing discovery about relationships, how to recognize when you're caught in a psychological loop, why these loops feel so much like love, and most importantly, how to break free before they destroy you. But first, let me tell you about the case that opened Jung's eyes to this terrifying pattern. Chapter 1. The Woman Who Loved Too Much. In 1920, a woman named Elizabeth walked into Jung's office in Zurich. She was 32, intelligent, successful in her career, but completely consumed by her relationship with a man who treated her terribly. He was emotionally unavailable, often cruel, and had made it clear he would never commit to her. Yet Elizabeth couldn't stay away. "I know he's not good for me," she told Jung through tears. "I know I should leave, but I can't. I need him like I need air." Jung had seen this pattern before, but Elizabeth's case was extreme. She had given up her friends, her hobbies, even her career advancement, all to be available whenever this man decided he wanted her. She lived in a constant state of anxiety, alternating between euphoric highs when he showed her attention and devastating lows when he withdrew. "Dr. Jung," she said, "I love him so much it's killing me." Jung looked at this brilliant, accomplished woman and saw something that would change his understanding of human relationships forever. This wasn't love. This was a psychological prison. "Tell me about your father," Jung said quietly. Elizabeth's face crumpled. Her father had been charming but unreliable, showering her with attention one moment and disappearing the next. He had been an alcoholic who made grand promises he never kept, who would sweep into her life with gifts and apologies only to vanish again when she needed him most. Jung realized that Elizabeth wasn't in love with her current partner. She was reliving her relationship with her father, trapped in a loop of seeking validation from someone who couldn't give it to her. The very pain that made the relationship feel so intense was actually the echo of an old wound demanding to be healed. But here's what shocked Jung. Elizabeth wasn't unusual. As he began to pay attention to this pattern, he found it everywhere. Chapter 2. The Anatomy of the Loop. Jung began to study what he called psychological loops in relationships. Compulsive patterns where people become addicted to the very dynamics that cause them suffering. He identified several key characteristics that distinguish these loops from genuine love. First, the relationship creates an obsessive preoccupation. The person can't stop thinking about their partner, even when the partner is clearly unavailable or harmful. This isn't the warm, secure feeling of love. It's the desperate anxiety of addiction. Second, there's a cycle of intermittent reinforcement. The partner provides just enough attention to keep the person hooked, but never enough to create security. This creates a psychological effect similar to gambling. The unpredictable rewards make the addiction even stronger. Third, the person loses themselves in the relationship. They abandon their own interests, values, and goals to accommodate their partner's needs or to avoid conflict. What feels like devotion is actually self-abandonment. Fourth, there's a quality of desperation. The thought of losing the relationship creates panic, not sadness. The person feels they literally cannot survive without their partner, which Jung recognized as a sign of psychological dependency, not love. Jung realized that these loops were incredibly common, but they were almost never recognized for what they were. Society celebrated them as great love stories, as evidence of passion and devotion. But Jung saw them as symptoms of unresolved psychological wounds. The most dangerous person, Jung wrote, is the one who listens to nobody but himself. Chapter 3. The Shadow of Love. Jung's concept of the shadow, the repressed, unconscious parts of ourselves, was crucial to understanding these psychological loops. He discovered that we often fall into these patterns because we're unconsciously trying to heal old wounds or integrate rejected parts of ourselves through another person. Elizabeth, for example, had learned in childhood that love was conditional and unpredictable. She had developed a deep fear of abandonment, but also a belief that she was only worthy of love when she was perfect. Her relationship with the unavailable man wasn't about love. It was about trying to finally win the game she had lost with her father. Jung identified several common shadow patterns that create these loops. The rescuer loop. People who become addicted to fixing broken partners, often because they learned in childhood that their value came from taking care of others' needs while ignoring their own. The validation loop. People who become obsessed with partners who withhold approval because they're trying to heal wounds from childhood experiences of conditional love. The excitement loop. People who mistake drama and chaos for passion, often because they equate love with intensity rather than security. The sacrifice loop. People who give up everything for their partner, believing that self-sacrifice proves their love, when it actually proves their lack of self-worth. Jung realized that these patterns were unconscious attempts at psychological healing, but they were doomed to fail because they were based on the false premise that another person could heal our internal wounds. Chapter 4. The Projection Trap. One of Jung's most important discoveries was the role of projection in these psychological loops. He found that people often fall in love, not with the actual person, but with their own projections, qualities they desperately want or need, but have disowned in themselves. Jung worked with a man named Klaus who was obsessed with a woman he described as free-spirited and adventurous. Klaus had grown up in a rigid, controlling family where spontaneity was discouraged. He had learned to be responsible and reliable, but had buried his own desire for freedom and adventure. His love for this woman was actually his unconscious longing for his own repressed spontaneity. He wasn't seeing her as she actually was. He was seeing her as the embodiment of everything he wished he could be, but felt he couldn't. When Jung helped Klaus recognize this projection, something remarkable happened. Klaus began to develop his own capacity for spontaneity and adventure, and as he did, his obsession with the woman began to fade. He realized he had never actually known her as a person. He had only been in love with his own projection. Everything that irritates us about others, Jung observed, can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This was the key insight. Psychological loops aren't about the other person at all. They're about our own unresolved internal conflicts, our own rejected parts, our own unhealed wounds. The other person is just a screen onto which we project our own psychological material. Chapter 5. The Anima and Animus Trap. Jung's concepts of the anima and animus, the unconscious feminine and masculine aspects within each person, were central to understanding romantic psychological loops. He discovered that many people become trapped in relationships because they're unconsciously seeking their own undeveloped gender qualities in their partner. Men, Jung found, often project their undeveloped emotional, intuitive, or nurturing qualities, the anima, onto women, then become obsessed with women who embody these qualities. Instead of developing their own emotional intelligence, they become dependent on women to provide emotional guidance and connection. Women, similarly, often project their undeveloped assertive, logical, or independent qualities, the animus, onto men, then become obsessed with men who embody these qualities. Instead of developing their own strength and independence, they become dependent on men to provide direction and protection. Jung worked with a woman named Maria who had been in a series of relationships with dominant, controlling men. She described herself as naturally submissive and said she was attracted to strong men who could take care of her. But Jung recognized that Maria was projecting her own undeveloped assertiveness and independence onto these men. Through their work together, Maria began to recognize that her attraction to controlling men was actually her own disowned power-seeking expression. As she learned to develop her own assertiveness and independence, her attraction to controlling men disappeared. She began to be drawn to men who were partners, not caretakers. The meeting of two personalities, Jung wrote, is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But in psychological loops, there's no real meeting of personalities. There's only the collision of projections. Chapter 6. The Addiction Model. Jung was ahead of his time in recognizing that psychological loops in relationships operate very much like addictions. The same brain chemistry that creates addiction to substances also creates addiction to relationship patterns. He identified the cycle. The person experiences withdrawal symptoms when separated from their partner, anxiety, depression, obsessive thoughts, followed by relief and euphoria when reunited. This creates a biochemical dependency that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with addiction. Jung worked with a man named Heinrich, who had been married for 15 years to a woman who was emotionally abusive. Heinrich would regularly threaten to leave, but he never could. He would describe feeling physically ill when he thought about ending the marriage, experiencing symptoms that Jung recognized as identical to drug withdrawal. "I know she's destroying me," Heinrich told Jung, "but I can't imagine life without her. The thought of leaving makes me feel like I'm dying." Jung helped Heinrich understand that his body had become addicted to the stress hormones produced by the relationship's chaos. The drama, the conflict, the cycle of breakup and reconciliation, all of this was creating a biochemical dependency that felt like love, but was actually addiction. Through careful work, Jung helped Heinrich recognize the difference between love and addiction. Love, Jung explained, creates a sense of peace, growth, and expansion. Addiction creates anxiety, obsession, and contraction. Chapter 7. The Mother and Father Wounds. Jung discovered that most psychological loops in adult relationships stem from unresolved wounds with our parents. These wounds create what he called complexes, autonomous psychological patterns that take over our rational mind when triggered. He identified several common parental wound patterns. The absent father complex. People who had emotionally or physically absent fathers often become obsessed with unavailable partners, unconsciously trying to win the love they never received from their father. The overbearing mother complex. People who had controlling mothers often become attracted to partners who try to control them, because this feels familiar and therefore safe. The critical parent complex. People who had overly critical parents often become addicted to partners who criticize them, because they're unconsciously trying to finally win approval from the critical voice. The abandoning parent complex. People who experienced abandonment in childhood often create relationships where they're constantly threatened with abandonment because they're trying to master the original trauma. Jung realized that these patterns are entirely unconscious. People don't choose to be attracted to partners who recreate their childhood wounds. They're compelled by forces they don't understand. But here's what Jung discovered. Once these patterns become conscious, they lose their power. When we can see the loop, we can break the loop. Chapter 8. The False Self in Love. Jung's work with psychological loops led him to understand something crucial about authentic versus false self. He discovered that many people never actually show up as themselves in relationships. Instead, they present a false self designed to win and keep love. This false self is created in childhood as a survival mechanism. Children learn that certain parts of themselves are acceptable to their parents and certain parts are not. They develop a good self that gets love and hide the bad self that gets rejected. In adult relationships, this false self shows up as people-pleasing, constant accommodation, inability to set boundaries, and a terror of conflict. The person believes that if they show their true self, they will be rejected. So they remain in a psychological loop of trying to earn love by being someone they're not. Jung worked with a woman named Anna, who had been married for 10 years but felt completely unknown by her husband. She had never expressed her real opinions, preferences, or needs because she was afraid he would leave her if he knew who she really was. "I don't even know who I am anymore," Anna told Jung. "I've been pretending for so long that I've lost myself." Jung helped Anna understand that her fear of being known was actually a fear of being herself. Through their work together, Anna began to risk showing her authentic self in her marriage. To her surprise, her husband was relieved. He had been sensing the falseness, and it was creating distance between them. But here's what Jung discovered. Not all relationships can survive this kind of authenticity. Some relationships are based entirely on the false self dynamic, and when one person becomes authentic, the relationship ends. Jung saw this not as failure, but as necessary growth. Chapter 9. The Trauma Bond. Jung was one of the first psychologists to understand what we now call trauma bonding, the psychological phenomenon where people become attached to those who hurt them. He recognized this as one of the most dangerous forms of psychological loop. In trauma bonding, the very person who creates the trauma also provides the relief from it. This creates an incredibly strong psychological bond that feels like love, but is actually a survival mechanism. Jung worked with a woman named Greta who was in an abusive relationship. Her partner would rage at her, then apologize and shower her with affection. Greta found herself addicted to the relief and connection that came after the abuse, even though she knew the pattern was destroying her. "When he's kind to me after he's been cruel," Greta told Jung, "I feel more grateful than I've ever felt for anything. It's like he's saving me from drowning, even though he's the one who pushed me into the water." Jung realized that trauma bonding creates a psychological loop because it hijacks our natural bonding mechanisms. Our brains are wired to bond with those who help us survive, but in trauma bonding, the abuser becomes associated with both the threat and the relief. Breaking trauma bonds, Jung discovered, requires understanding that the relief is artificial. It's not genuine love or connection, but rather the temporary cessation of induced suffering. Chapter 10. The Scarcity Mindset. Jung identified another crucial component of psychological loops, the scarcity mindset around love. People caught in these loops often believe that love is rare, that they won't find it again, that they should be grateful for whatever they can get. This scarcity mindset keeps people trapped in harmful relationships because they're more afraid of being alone than of being mistreated. Jung recognized this as a fundamental misunderstanding of both love and self-worth. He worked with a man named Otto who stayed in a relationship with a woman who treated him with contempt because he believed she was out of his league and that he was lucky to have her at all. "I'm not much to look at," Otto told Jung. "I should be grateful that someone like her would even consider being with me." Jung helped Otto understand that this mindset was actually creating the very dynamic that was destroying him. By believing he was unworthy of love, Otto was unconsciously seeking out partners who would confirm this belief. Through their work together, Otto began to develop what Jung called self-worth that is not dependent on external validation. As Otto's self-worth grew, his tolerance for mistreatment disappeared. He began to attract partners who treated him with respect because he had learned to treat himself with respect. Chapter 11. The Codependency Trap. Long before the term codependency was popular, Jung was studying the psychological patterns that create it. He recognized codependency as a form of psychological loop, where people become addicted to being needed by others who are dysfunctional. Jung worked with a woman named Lotte, who was married to an alcoholic. Lotte spent all her time trying to manage her husband's drinking, covering for him, and taking care of the problems his addiction created. She told Jung she was staying because she loved him too much to leave. But Jung recognized that Lotte's love was actually a form of control. By being indispensable to her husband, she avoided facing her own fears of abandonment and inadequacy. Her husband's dysfunction made her feel needed and important. "You're not helping him," Jung told Lotte. "You're enabling him. And you're not doing it because you love him. You're doing it because you need to feel needed." This was a revolutionary insight. Jung realized that many people who present as loving and sacrificial are actually in psychological loops that serve their own unconscious needs for control, validation, or significance. Breaking the codependency loop, Jung discovered, requires learning to get these needs met in healthy ways, through genuine self-care, authentic relationships, and meaningful work in the world. Chapter 12. The Comparison Trap. Jung also identified how comparison creates psychological loops in relationships. He found that many people become obsessed with partners who are better than them in some way, more attractive, more successful, more intelligent, because they're trying to raise their own status through association. This creates a dynamic where the person never feels secure in the relationship because they believe their partner could do better. They live in constant fear of being left for someone more worthy. Jung worked with a man named Friedrich, who was obsessed with a woman he considered the most beautiful woman in the city. Friedrich spent all his time trying to impress her, constantly buying her gifts and taking her to expensive places he couldn't afford. "I can't believe someone like her would be with someone like me," Friedrich told Jung. "I have to make sure she never realizes she could do better." Jung helped Friedrich understand that this dynamic was doomed to fail. By constantly trying to prove his worth through external means, Friedrich was actually demonstrating his own lack of self-worth. His desperation was pushing away the very person he was trying to keep. More importantly, Jung realized that Friedrich wasn't actually in love with this woman. He was in love with the idea of what having her would say about him. He was using her as a trophy to prop up his own inadequate sense of self. Chapter 13. The Fantasy Love Loop. One of Jung's most important discoveries was the role of fantasy in psychological loops. He found that many people become addicted not to the actual person, but to their fantasy of what the relationship could become. This fantasy love loop is particularly dangerous because it's based entirely on potential rather than reality. The person sees glimpses of what they want in their partner and becomes convinced that if they just love enough, try enough, or wait enough, the fantasy will become reality. Jung worked with a woman named Petra, who had been in an on and off relationship for 5 years with a man who was emotionally unavailable. Every few months he would show her just enough attention to keep her hooked, then disappear again. "I know who he really is underneath," Petra told Jung. "He's been hurt before, but I can see his true self. He just needs someone to love him enough to help him heal." Jung recognized this as the fantasy love loop. Petra wasn't in love with her partner as he actually was. She was in love with her projection of who he could become. She was trying to love him into transformation, which Jung knew was impossible. "You cannot love someone into being who you want them to be," Jung told Petra. "You can only love them as they are, or not at all." Chapter 14. The Intensity Confusion. Jung discovered that many people confuse intensity with love. They believe that if a relationship creates strong emotions, whether positive or negative, it must be meaningful. This confusion leads to psychological loops where people become addicted to drama, chaos, and emotional extremes. Jung worked with a couple, Hans and Ingrid, who had a relationship that was constantly explosive. They would fight passionately, break up dramatically, then reconcile with equally intense emotion. Both believed this intensity proved their love was real and deep. But Jung recognized that this intensity was actually a sign of dysfunction. Healthy love, he realized, is characterized by peace, not chaos. It creates a sense of security and stability, not constant emotional upheaval. "You're not in love," Jung told Hans and Ingrid. "You're addicted to the biochemical high of emotional intensity. But intensity is not intimacy, and chaos is not connection." Jung helped them understand that genuine love allows people to be calm together, to exist in peaceful silence, to support each other's growth without constant drama. The intensity they had mistaken for love was actually the friction created by two people who were fundamentally incompatible, trying to force a connection. Chapter 15. The Healing Begins. Jung's approach to breaking psychological loops wasn't about willpower or simply choosing different partners. He understood that these patterns were unconscious and required deep psychological work to resolve. The first step, Jung discovered, was recognition. People had to become aware that they were in a loop, that what they were experiencing wasn't love but psychological compulsion. This recognition often came as a shock, because the intensity of the loop had felt so much like love. The second step was understanding the origin of the loop. Jung would help people trace their relationship patterns back to their earliest experiences, identifying the wounds and beliefs that were driving their behavior. The third step was integration. Jung would help people reclaim the parts of themselves they had projected onto their partners. Instead of seeking their missing qualities in others, they would learn to develop these qualities within themselves. The fourth step was developing genuine self-love. Jung realized that people who truly love themselves don't become trapped in psychological loops because they won't tolerate treatment that doesn't match their self-worth. The fifth step was learning to recognize the difference between love and addiction. Jung would teach people to notice how different relationships felt in their body. Love creates expansion and peace, while addiction creates contraction and anxiety. Chapter 16. The Awakening. Elizabeth, the woman who had been trapped in the loop with her unavailable partner, worked with Jung for 2 years. The breakthrough came when she finally understood that her desperate need for his approval was actually her desperate need for her own father's approval, something she would never receive because her father had died years earlier. "I've been trying to get from him what my father never gave me," she told Jung. "But he can't give me that. No one can give me that. I have to give it to myself." This realization freed Elizabeth from the psychological loop. She began to develop her own sense of self-worth that wasn't dependent on external validation. She started pursuing her own interests again, reconnecting with friends, and focusing on her career. To her surprise, as she became less available and desperate, her partner began to pursue her more intensely. But now that she could see the dynamic clearly, she was no longer interested. She had tasted genuine self-love, and the scraps of attention he offered felt insulting by comparison. "It's not love," she told Jung in their final session. "It never was. It was just two wounded people using each other to avoid healing their own wounds." Chapter 17. The Difference Between Love and Loops. Jung's work with psychological loops led him to develop a clear understanding of the difference between genuine love and psychological compulsion. He identified several key characteristics of real love. Real love creates peace, not anxiety. When you're with someone you genuinely love, you feel calm and secure, not constantly worried about losing them. Real love supports your growth, not your stagnation. A loving partner encourages you to become more yourself, not less. Real love is based on reality, not fantasy. You love the person as they actually are, not as you imagine they could become. Real love enhances your life, not consumes it. A loving relationship adds to your existing life rather than becoming your entire life. Real love is secure, not desperate. You want to be with your partner, but you don't need to be with them to feel whole. Real love is mutual, not one-sided. Both people are equally invested in the relationship's success. Real love allows for individuality, not codependency. You maintain your own identity, interests, and relationships outside the romantic partnership. Jung realized that most people had never experienced genuine love because they had been trapped in psychological loops that they mistook for love. Breaking these loops wasn't just about ending unhealthy relationships. It was about learning to love authentically for the first time. Chapter 18. The Modern Epidemic. If Jung were alive today, he would likely be horrified by how psychological loops have been amplified by modern technology and culture. Social media, dating apps, and the general acceleration of modern life have created perfect conditions for these loops to flourish. The intermittent reinforcement of social media, the unpredictable likes, comments, and messages, creates the same addictive patterns that Jung identified in unhealthy relationships. People become addicted to the validation of others, constantly seeking external approval to fill internal voids. Dating apps create a scarcity mindset by presenting endless options, making people feel like they need to settle for whatever they can get or constantly search for someone better. This prevents the deep presence and commitment necessary for genuine love. The pace of modern life prevents the kind of deep self-reflection that Jung knew was necessary to break psychological loops. People stay constantly busy and distracted, avoiding the inner work that would free them from these patterns. Jung would likely see the modern epidemics of anxiety, depression, and relationship dysfunction as symptoms of a culture that has lost touch with genuine love and authentic connection. We've become addicted to the very patterns that keep us from experiencing what we most deeply want. Chapter 19. Breaking Free. But Jung's message isn't one of despair, it's one of hope. He discovered that once people understand the nature of psychological loops, they can break free from them. The key is developing what Jung called conscious relationship, the ability to see clearly what's actually happening rather than being lost in projection and fantasy. Conscious relationship requires several elements: self-awareness, understanding your own patterns, triggers, and unconscious motivations; self-love, developing a genuine appreciation for yourself that doesn't depend on external validation; boundaries, the ability to say no to treatment that doesn't match your worth; patience, the willingness to wait for genuine connection rather than settling for psychological loops; courage, the bravery to face your own wounds rather than using others to avoid them; presence, the ability to see people as they actually are rather than as projections of your own needs. Jung believed that breaking free from psychological loops wasn't just about individual healing, it was about evolving human consciousness itself. As more people learn to love authentically, the collective patterns of dysfunction begin to shift. As we reach the end of Jung's warning about psychological loops, you're faced with a choice. You can continue to mistake intensity for love, addiction for connection, and psychological compulsion for romance. Or you can begin the difficult but liberating work of learning to love authentically. Jung's message is clear. What you think is love might actually be a psychological prison. The person you think you can't live without might actually be keeping you from the life you're meant to live. The relationship you think is saving you might actually be destroying you. But here's the hope Jung offers. Once you can see the loop, you can break the loop. Once you understand the difference between love and addiction, you can choose love. Once you learn to fill your own voids, you can connect with others from wholeness rather than neediness. The question isn't whether you'll face challenges in relationships. The question is, will you keep repeating the same painful patterns, or will you do the work necessary to love and be loved authentically? Jung showed us that genuine love is possible, but it requires courage, the courage to face our own wounds, to take responsibility for our own healing, and to show up as whole people rather than half people seeking completion through others. Your psychological loops are not evidence of how much you love. They're evidence of how much you need to heal. The person who can save you from these patterns isn't out there somewhere. They're looking back at you in the mirror. The love you're seeking isn't in someone else's hands, it's in your own. Jung warned us about the loops. Now it's time to break free. The choice is yours.